Welcome to the Ray Harryhausen Podcast, the show dedicated to the life, career and films of a special effects titan. Join us as we host in-depth discussions about the work, influences and legacy of this uniquely talented filmmaker. Brought to you by the Ray and Diana Harryhausen Foundation, we will be delving into Ray's archive to bring a unique insight into his work, including exclusive audio from the man himself from our own archives. We will be joined by special guests for retrospectives, exclusive announcements and competitions. So this podcast is a must-listen for all fans of the world of Ray Harryhausen, animation and classic filmmaking.
Hello and welcome to the Ray Harryhausen Podcast. This is episode 49 of the podcast and number 17 of the Vodcast. And this is a special two-parter that we're putting together in one episode where we speak to model maker Brian Smithies. Now, you may or may not know the name Brian Smithies, but if I run you through some of my favourite credits on the films he's worked on, and he's worked on many, many films, the original Superman the movie, Dracula from 1979, the John Badham version, of course, Clash of the Titans, that's why he's with us today, The Great Muppet Caper, perhaps the greatest puppet film ever put on film. I love The Great Muppet Caper, the second Muppet movie. The Dark Crystal, Octopussy, Amadeus, Dune, the David Lynch one, of course, the better Dune, Aliens, Sky Bandits, The Living Daylights, the BFG, The Never-Ending Story, Part 3, GoldenEye, Tomorrow Never Dies, The World Is Not Enough, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, and Die Another Day. How absolutely thrilling for us to speak to Brian Smithies. And we spoke to him with Vanessa Harryhausen and, of course, with Connor Heaney, our collections manager, who joins us for all of these episodes. Connor, hello. How are you today, sir?
Hello, I'm very well, and I was enjoying listening to you relate there Brian's filmography. I mean, like you say, I when I was speaking to Brian, I was taking a look over his IMDb page, and it is pretty jaw-dropping the amount of classic films that he's worked upon. I think of Die Another Day as quite a recent movie. Of course, it's not that recent anymore, but in my mind, it's a new Bond film. But yes, spanning the history of these blockbuster films and having so many interesting stories to tell.
Absolutely. So let's get cracking on our mega double episode interview, which you're going to see in this and hear in this one episode. Let's go. Great stuff. Look, Brian, this is Vanessa Harryhausen, Ray Harryhausen's only daughter. We think anyway, Vanessa, don't we?
Well, I hope so.
and so myself and Vanessa are trustees of the Ray and Diana Harryhausen Foundation. Connor Heaney is our collections manager, and this is going to be an exciting podcast and a vodcast. So it used to be a podcast just audio only. Now it's also video. So right. That's why I always make sure I have an iron shirt on.
Oh. Sorry. No, I met Vanessa years ago. She's a young girl.
I was
went to art school. And that was at Ray's house.
Oh.
At your home.
At Ilchester.
Yeah, Ilchester Place, was it?
Yeah.
And Brian, do you remember what year that might have been? So we could have placed what film that is. Was that in the late 70s or mid 70s? What would you have said?
Do
you know, Vanessa?
Maybe it was even the 80s.
Early 80s, yeah. Clash of the Titans. Fabulous.
Yes. And I think I'd gone up there for dinner with Ray and Diana.
Oh, good.
You had some questions about Janet Stevens.
Yes, that was initially why we got in touch with you. We honoured Janet Stevens in our Ray Harryhausen Awards this year. We put her into our Harryhausen Hall of Fame. There's some lovely photographs of her with Ray, and some nice stories. But we were sort of delving for some further information, and you mentioned that you have some strong memories of working with her.
Well, she was lovely. I mean, she was extremely talented and a lovely person. Then always seemed to be that way with people Ray had working with him. They all seemed very nice.
Yes, we've been very lucky. We've been able to talk to a few people that worked with Ray or on Clash of the Titans or other films, and it's always been a very positive experience. It's really great to capture these memories.
Well, my first possible experience with Ray would have been actually with, I think it was Sinbad. Sinbad. He was doing that when I'd just finished working in Malta, and I was asked to join the film. And I had enough of being away from home for 7 months, I think. So instead of going on to work with Ray on that film, I went back to the family. Janet was, she did all the little models for Ray, and Ray did the drawings, but his animation models were done by Janet, and she would the casting of the rubber.
We were just talking earlier about Janet Stevens, Brian, weren't we? And it's how unusual was it for someone like Janet to be in the film model making business when it was mostly it was quite male dominated, wasn't it?
But she was talented, and I think on the artistic side, there were several female sculptors who were excellent. So it wasn't an exceptional thing. Maybe on camera crews and things like that, you didn't have many females, but on the artistic side, definitely. Certainly on the modeling side, I think maybe the art department was still a bit chauvinistic. But Janet was very talented and a lovely lady. And, she used to do several sizes of miniatures for Ray. And she actually modeled the tiny, not that high, columned temples that went up on the back of the set at
Oh, wow.
I think she modeled those. And then I photographed them and put them together using a camera, which Ray had actually set me up a studio next to his for about 6 months, and I did a lot of the sort of optical and model work.
Wow.
And it was brilliant because I loved Ray. I mean, he was a brilliant man. And he was so easy about telling you about things and stories, and he was wonderful. And you never got bored. But I've made a sort of list of one of the things I also did for Ray was make up armatures and, little adjustable armatures that he used.
Oh, wow.
And put those into some of the models for him. And I maintained them while I was doing the other stuff.
Gosh. How exciting.
It was. I mean, he had so many stories. And the camera he used was, I think, belonged to Willis O'Brien.
Oh, my goodness.
King Kong. And that was his favorite camera. And it was something like Mitchell number 23 or something.
Oh, wow.
And he gave me the projector that Willis O'Brien used, which was an old Clappergate. I forget the name of it. It could be Acme movement, I think.
Uh-huh.
And so if I ever had a hair in the gate, I'd keep it in case it was one of Fay Ray's. But anyway.
But the Mitchell camera is famous, isn't it, for creating a steady image? Is that right, Brian? So it was favoured by special effects folk to use a Mitchell where possible.
Oh, it's great. But the camera that Charlie, when I joined Ray, after the main film, I'd sort of worked out a load of notes here, which actually probably quite a good idea to stick to the notes I've got here, but it'll make quite a long interview. Is that all right?
That's fine by us.
Yeah,
I mean,
no, I think-
we're all ears.
Yeah.
Absolutely, I'm poised.
Well, I mean, I'll start. I came on. I had about 3 weeks to prepare everything to get into a container to go to Spain and Malta and elsewhere, Italy. Because I was brought on to the film very late, and I had to do a lot of quick thinking. I think it was about 3 or 4 weeks before we departed to get everything ready. And just before we departed, they had a setup of Olympus with Laurence Olivier and the other stars, all they were going to be smoke, dry ice sort of floating around them, so that they were paddling through this fog. And they were still building the set. And so I was told that they were going to shoot that day. And I was told by the director, oh, don't worry about dry ice too much. I just want some to float through. So I said, I went and saw the construction manager and said, look, I need to build a fence, a wall around the stage to hold the dry ice in. Otherwise, it just dissipates and you can't do anything with it. And I ordered a thing of dry ice and one machine. So anyway, that's all you wanted. I mean, that's all I could supply. And the construction manager said, well, we can't give you a wall at all, but we'll try and think of something on the day. And then Charlie sent me over to the theatre to see, I forget what it was. It was a science fiction film where he wanted me to see zapping, laser zaps. And I sat through this film and I couldn't see anything that was useful on. It was high tech. And somehow he didn't want high tech with Clash of the Titans. So I sat through, wasted an afternoon. And during that time, I had a couple of people doing the dry ice smoke. And when I came out of the cinema, I was told that Charlie wanted to see me up in the office. So I went up to Charlie's office and he started lambasting me. He said, there's supposed to be 3 foot deep layer of dry ice across the stage, and there was nothing there, just a bit wafting across. I said, that's what I was asked for. I said to him, look, the construction could not give me a wall to contain the dry ice to build up any depth. It just flowed straight out. And they were still building the set. They hadn't got time to build a wall to encase dry ice. And he said, well, so whose fault is it? I said, it's nobody's fault. So he carried on having a go at me. And I said, well, hang on a moment, Charlie. Do you know how much a tub of dry ice, in those days, this was quite a big sum of money, in a tub of a container of dry ice costs? I said, it's £1,000. You know how much to hire 3 dry ice machines or 4 dry ice machines to give you the depth would be? And I said, that's another 400, 500, 600 pounds with an operator. Well, I haven't got the crew. You haven't given me the crew to do it. So I've got to bring those people in on dailies. And he suddenly stopped. He said, Brian, I like the way you think.
And just to clarify for people listening, of course,
after that we were good
Charlie
friends.
is Schneer, isn't it?
Yeah, Charlie is the film's producer,
Yeah.
Charles Schneer, who was an American, like Ray Harryhausen was an American,
Yeah.
but a polar opposite gentleman. He had a very different working style, Brian, didn't he, than Mr. Harryhausen did?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, but he had to. I mean, Ray was a dreamer. He was a creative, and Ray wanted what he wanted. Charlie wanted his budget down.
But this was the biggest budget they ever had, though, wasn't it?
After I said
$15
that,
million.
the price he was quoting, I was quoting, he went from being antagonistic towards me. He hadn't really met me. Well, when he employed me, he had. And he said, I like your thinking there, Brian. I like you. I think we'll work well together. And that was the end of the argument. But Brian, he was going to sack the carpenter for not putting up the wall, and he was going to sack everybody, you know. It was Charlie. And he was just a lot of bluster, but he was a nice guy underneath it all. And I had the same problem throughout the film. I was undercrewed, and throughout the film, Charlie was always trying to sort of. He was always watching. He always knew what was going on, and he started sacking crews. So the props had to get rid of people, and the camera crews had to reduce, and everyone had to. This is when we were in Malta, and so what happened was he then called me into the office, and I thought, well, Charlie, I haven't got anyone. And he said, oh, no, I don't. I watch you guys work. He said, it's incredible. I think you're overworking, and I don't want you to burn out. And so he said, look, what I want to do with you is, so I said, I'd like another couple of people, and that would make a hell of a difference. And so he said, he turned to, forget the production manager's name, oldest chap, John, I can't remember his name. Anyway, the production manager was in the office next door, and Charlie had the door open. He said, we only had, I think, one car on the unit, and I was using that for running around different locations, setting everything up. He said, oh, John, I can't remember his name. John, we want to get 2 more people over. How much is it going to cost? And John said, well, to fly them, it's going to cost them £250 each, and hotels, well, that's another £250 a week, and per diem. And Charlie suddenly said, okay, John, how about another car? And so I didn't get any more crew, but I got another car. So one of my other crew had a car. But anyway, I mean, that you got used to Charlie. He was full of good intentions, but he had to keep the budget. And that's how I suppose they worked very well together, because Charlie kept Ray in control of it. Ray had these wonderful visions. And when we were shooting up in Antiquera, the complications with Ray's shooting is that he had to have a steady image, and he had to have a full exposure. Mm-hmm. If you don't have a full exposure, then when you go to a second generation or a third generation of film, which Ray did, you'd have to go down a couple of generations of film, the contrast increases and the color bleaches out. So the color becomes desaturated, and the contrast becomes oversaturated. Wow. And there was this battle royal that went on the whole film between him and the director. I can't remember the director's name.
Desmond Davis?
Yes. He wanted the film to be the way he saw it, and it had to be lit the way he wanted it. And of course, lighting cameraman's name Moore.
Ted Moore, was it? Ted Moore? Yeah.
Ted Moore.
Well done.
Ted Moore had to sort out keeping Ray happy, because he knew that Ray had the problems, and the director didn't. The director was just wanting to, he was a bit airy-fairy and wanted everything to be just perfect. The way he wanted lighting and everything else the way he wanted it, the way he saw it in front of him, the way the camera saw it. And then Ray had to sort out these problems afterwards, unfortunately, which were to do with the exposure and the color saturation and the contrast. And we had a lot of problems.
So was this on the background plates, Brian? Can I just ask you, was this shooting the background plates? It wouldn't match them with the location footage that had been shot, if you like, with Ted Moore and Desmond Davis. Ray was the producer on the picture, so he could have really pulled rank there and said, hang on a minute, it's going to be my way or the highway.
Ray was a lovely man. He really was. I loved Ray. He tried to stand his ground as much as he could. But in fact, it gave a lot of problems.
What part did Metro Color play in it? Because Ray used to like going to Technicolor. I know that he had a lovely partnership with Kodak. He worked with the folks down at Hemel Hempstead at Kodak and Technicolor to create what he needed. But on Clash of the Titans, it all changed. He was using Metrocolor. It wasn't the lab he liked. It wasn't necessarily always shooting on the stocks that he wanted, because Charlie did a deal on that. How much was that frustrating for your process as well? Do you know?
Well, I thought we were dealing with Denim Studios, Denim Film Labs. I can't remember if it was Metro or who it was. Remember, it's 4 years ago. Give us a break. I seem to remember that it worked very well, whoever it was, whether it was Kodak, Metrocolor, or whoever. Because we used to, we had to shoot wedge tests before we shot anything, so that you could adjust the exposure and the color balance and the lighting and so on. And they would do the wedge test, and we'd get it back the next morning, and then we would shoot. And because of the equipment, as I say, Charlie did a very special deal on getting me a camera, and he bought this standard Mitchell 35 with a rack over. And Ray's equipment was, I think he inherited it from well, I think it'd all been used on King Kong. His top frame, he had a huge box which had a 1 horsepower electric motor in it, a huge thing. And it had a solenoid, and it had to be mounted on a tripod, which then had to be tied to the floor with steel chains to stop it vibrating and jumping out of kilter. And you then had to count to 7 before you could do the next shot, while the vibrations all died down. So it used to take a long time to do a shot. And Ray, of course, used to do his moves during that time. But I was trying to do optical work with the miniature, the little miniatures I told you about that Janet had done. And it became, well, first of all, let me finish the story of the camera. It was a deal he did with somebody, and he got it very cheap, and he used to glow in the dark. I think it was one of the ones that was used on bikini atom blasts. So it was radioactive, this thing. So I was never too sure if some of the optical problems I had were related to the radioactivity in it. And they then sent him over a set of 16mm lenses to go with it, which he also did on this deal. And he did manage to get those changed for 35mm. So that was Charlie doing another deal. But
Brian, sorry to interrupt you. What problems were you having though? Was it flared? Were you getting flares during your rushes, or was it flash frames? What were the actual technical problems arising from that camera?
The major problem with that camera was the fact we traced it down. We sent it back to a camera company up in Elstree that was looking after all Ray's equipment. And they tested it out. They tested it out at normal speed and everything else. And I said, well, no, for God's sake, I'm using it at stop frame. Please do it to stop frame test. So they said, well, no, if it's operating steady at normal speed, then it's fine. And it wasn't. So anyway, it was the top left-hand corner was breathing. And if you're doing a 4 or 5-way split on a mat, that is a hell of a problem.
Yes.
Because you're winding back the film and you're shooting again and overlaying, and you can't have that.
No.
You can't. And so anyway, I got the Pinewood chap, Charlie Greenwood, I think his name was. He was the cameraman for camera maintenance man for Pinewood. He saw a bit of the footage I'd shot, and then he said, well, let's have a look at the camera. So he came over to the studio, opened the top, looked at it and said, oh, I can see what's wrong, just like that. And he took the pressure plate out, and he ground a 100th of a millionth of an inch off it or something, minute amount, and it was absolutely perfect after that.
Wow.
Wow.
But the thing with the actual motor driving it was this huge box with this 1 horsepower massive motor and a shaft going into the side of the camera. And it really was a major problem. So eventually I managed to talk Ray into, I had one of these boxes at each end for the projector and the camera, and Ray had the same. I managed to talk him into buying an up-to-date motor drive for the S30 or the Mitchell camera. And so he bought half of it. So he still had to wait his 7 minutes or 7 seconds. But he bought half of it. And that really upgraded him. But he wouldn't do it for me. So I had to get on with doing it the old way. He was impressed though. So he did move with the times.
Do you remember, Brian, if there are any scenes that were planned that were cancelled because of time and budget constraints? Because we're always looking at Ray's notes to find out projects that were unmade and sequences that were cut from his films. And Clash of the Titans had a massive budget, but they could have had much more time. Time is what you can't buy with money. Do you remember any scenes that were abandoned?
Well, I can't really. No.
That's good.
I
That's
can't
good
think
producing.
of any that we actually did away with. Anyway, I mean, moving on from the dry ice, and we flew out to Spain, where we were filming in Granada at Guadix, and then we moved down to Antequera when we were shooting on top of the mountain El Torcal. And we had really, because I was so undercrewed, we had a hell of a problem trying to get all our smoke equipment and everything else, which from one side of the valley on the top of this mountain to the other side.
Wow.
And so that was, well, we had our own transport, which was a couple of mules. That was as fast as we could go. So the camera would sort of film that way, and they would turn around and they'd film that way. And they would obviously be instantly ready. They just had to turn the camera around. We had to get all the equipment from over there, move it over to there. And anyway, but wonderful locations, absolutely beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then we went we flew from Spain over to Italy. And of course, again, Charlie done a very cute deal on the plane flight. And I think as we flew, one of the outboard engines on this antiquated plane cut out or started spewing oil. And so they, instead of flying directly over to Italy, they had to put down at the nearest airport, which was actually Perpignan, which was the home airport for this air company that was failing. It was able to do a cheap deal with Charlie. They just went bankrupt. The airport is actually closed. They put us into the restaurant, which they got the lady from the village to come and make us tea and coffee and sandwiches. While they had a stepladder, and the plane was right outside the restaurant. And they had a stepladder up, and they had the side of the engine off, and they were fixing it with a welder.
Oh my God.
With the aircraft loaded with fuel, and they were welding bits on. It had a hole in the engine somewhere.
Wow.
Anyway, half the crew went by train from there because they wouldn't fly. And I think Ray went on the plane. I stayed with Ray, and we flew. We hopped around the northern coast of the Med there and went down to Rome that way instead of flying directly across. But that was fine. And, we had, we settled in Rome where we were shooting at Ostia Antica. And that was a wonderful place. It's wonderful, very, very domestic ruins. You could really feel the people who had lived there. And we had a nice little set there in the amphitheater. And we had to, again, shoot all our plates on the way there. And when we then went from there down to Palinuro, which was, I think, that one of the islands they used, had an island which they used on on Jason and the Argonauts. I think they'd used Palinuro then.
Wow.
I don't think it had really advanced much, but we got this new hotel, which hadn't ever had anyone in it. And they put us in there to test it out. And I think you had wine coming out of the taps and water in the wine bottles, but the color was right. But again, this was a place where Ray needed a lot of good quality plates to shoot the battle scene with the scorpions and the maggots falling out of the head of Medusa. And what happened when we got back? I'll jump around in Palinuro, because when we got back, I set up with Ray. We set up an area. We brought some of the same stones in the riverbed back to England.
Oh.
And they were laid out on this sheet of polythene, and then we had a load of giant maggots from a fishing company that provided worms for fishing. And so we filmed these maggots falling out of the bag and onto the gravel. And when Red was happy he got what he needed, we pulled the top of the polythene over the gravel and pulled it aside. And I went and got on with my stuff next door. And about a week later, or 2 weeks later, we couldn't figure out where all these flies were coming from.
I remember that, yeah.
There were flies everywhere. And we were spraying before we could shoot anything. And then halfway through the shot, the fly had wrecked. Sorry. We couldn't figure out where they were coming from. So Ray came into me and said, where are these flies coming from? I said, I don't know. They're bothering me too. And then it suddenly dawned on us. We'd pulled all the maggots into the stones and pulled the bag of stones to the side and forgotten about them. They'd turned into flies and they were huge. Thousands of them. So we had a day or two of spraying. And I mean, it's Ray's sense of humor there.
Do you remember when they lost the crocodile in the swamp, or the alligator in the swamp? Do you remember that?
I can't, no. Yes, it's sort of vaguely coming back.
Yeah, there was a whole load of team of people with sticks trying to find where this, I don't know, they said it was a small alligator or crocodile. I don't know which one it was, but they had to drain it in the end, and I think they did catch it, but nobody wanted to go into the swamp scene because nobody could find the damn alligator.
No, they're snappy buggers.
Yeah, and it's very dark, wasn't it? I think the swamp was the Lord of the Marshes, the swamp was very dark. Brian, the background plates for the scorpions, though, there were some technical problems there. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, because Ray needed a full exposure. He could then color it down day for night. He could do that himself. He could reduce the exposures as well, same time, but he had the option of full exposure would give him color and contrast. And those are the things he needed to be able to control. And Desmond had insisted on shooting it night for night, and Ray was stuck with this nonsense of trying to sort it out. It was a real problem. It was one of the worst problems he had on the film, I think.
And there was a bit of movement in the gate, and you can still see that now on the sequence when you watch it. There's a slight movement in the rear projection when it's shot with the foreground action. I know there was some trouble over that. He wanted to reshoot. Charlie wouldn't let him.
That's right. No, really, I remember we had a great long discussion of that, and obviously I backed Ray up on everything he wanted to do with Charlie, and I had to have words with Charlie too. But Charlie was absolutely immovable. He'd been there, he'd done that, he'd paid for that. That was it. And you can understand it from Charlie's point of view, but I think it was a shame that Ray had to struggle so hard with that. But it was one of the major problems he had was that sequence, because of the fact it was shot night for night. No color, heavy contrast, very difficult.
And there's also a kind of discrepancy with some of the filters, because filters were used in camera on location, and different filters for the sky. And when you see the final grade for the film, the color temperature seems to change, particularly around going to the island where Medusa is. What was the position there? Was Ted Moore allowed to use filters, and were the filters being directed by Des Davis?
The filters are being directed by Desmond Davis. I mean, this was the bone of contention that Ray had with Desmond. And Desmond was a petulant chap, stamped his foot. And poor old Ray, who's an awfully nice chap, I'm afraid lost out on that.
It's such a shame, because they always pick directors who worked really well with them. We think back at previous directors, whether it's Gordon Hessler or Sam Wanamaker and Nathan Duran. These are directors who work as part of the team, which is Ray Charles and the director. So this is such a shame on such a big film, £15 million budget, the biggest budget Ray ever had for a picture, and it was big even for those days. I know you'd worked on major motion pictures like Superman the movie, so it doesn't compare to that, but it's still for Ray Harryhausen, this is major money. It's a shame that I think it tested Charles Schneer, because it was the big leagues, MGM, £15 million. And I think that pressure was probably weighing heavily on Charles Schneer's shoulders, I imagine.
I think so, yes. Poor old Ray had to sort of make do with what he ended up with, and he wasn't allowed to reshoot any of it, which is a great shame. It did detract from the final product, but Ray did an amazing job.
Oh, he did
what he could.
Yeah.
So, other than the scorpion sequence, Brian, do you know any other scenes that Ray wasn't happy with that he would like to have reshot if there had been the time?
Well, he wanted all of his shots that he needed, his plates, to be clean. He didn't want filters on. He didn't want day for night or anything like that. He wanted a full exposure and clean. He can do the day for night. He can do the filters to match up. There's not a problem, and certainly not for Ray.
But really, Desmond Davis shouldn't have been directing those plates material. They should have just, on previous films, the director stands back and Ray comes in to shoot what he needs, locked off materials for plates and everything else. Yes. So that's a real shame. Des Davis had this kind of hold over everyone, which is crazy.
I didn't. I wasn't very keen on Desmond Davis.
Yeah.
So I always took Ray's side on that, certainly, because I understood the problems Ray would have. When we were on location, of course, Ray required a full exposure and no color filter put on the camera, so that he could work on it, and it wasn't destroyed by going another 2 generations down the line from processing. So that I'm getting in circles here. He needed a full exposure without filters, so that he could work on it afterwards. He can have the colors, the night sky or whatever, day for night. And the biggest problem was that Desmond Davis was demanding, because he didn't like the idea that he wasn't in control. He was demanding that Ted Moore gave exposure that he wanted, which was day for night with a night filter on. Well, when we got back, Ray had to sort this out, and it was dreadful. And I also I was working on some of the bits and pieces that had to be done, and the quality we had to work with was appalling. I think Ray'd almost wanted to go out and reshoot some of it, but he wasn't allowed to, obviously, because Charlie Schneer kept a very tight purse string. He had to. I mean, let's face it. Ray was a perfectionist. Charlie was a realist. And the two of them actually worked very, very well together as a team.
So in terms of your work on the picture, people think of Ray Harryhausen as doing all of the visual effects. So where were you sort of where were you working most? Where could somebody say when they watched the film, "Oh, that's Brian's work"?
All the floor effects, obviously, we did things like footprints walking across the sand, things appearing and disappearing, explosions of water as the kraken comes up, and all that sort of thing. All to work with Ray's animation later. And then at the end of the film, I did all the floor effects, supervised that with a minimal crew. I think I had 3 people.
Wow.
And
how would that compare to, say, Superman the movie or Dune? What would your team would be for those sort of films?
In those days, crews weren't large. You had to use your wits, and you shot what was needed for the film. You didn't cover your ass with 100 different angles. So you actually had a set of storyboards, which you were allowed to have in those days, and you had a script, and you worked through it, and you went through with the director and said, "Well, I can't do that one for that sort of money. We need to do this, or if we just change it slightly, it'll be better." And so you work very closely with Ray and the producer too, because I mean he's obviously got to meet the bill at the end of it, and he'll go through what you've put forward and trash half of it because he can't afford it. But in fact, we had a very good working relationship between Ray, Charles, and myself, and I enjoyed the film, and I developed a great respect for Charles and a liking for him because you knew where you stood with him.
Yeah, he was quite a straight shooter, wasn't he? I mean, I remember Jeremy Thomas was an assistant editor on I think Golden Voyage of Sinbad, and he berated him for buying pencils outside of the production for the cutting room as an assistant editor, and because he said, "Well, I buy all the stationery centrally here. You come and get your stationery from me." So everything down, even to stationery, back in the day, he was in control of. But he was right. Without Charles Schneer doing that, there would be no Ray Harryhausen as we know him.
No, the two worked very well together. They were complementary. One held the other back, and the other pushed forward. So, but anyway, I mean, I told you about the camera that Ray managed to negotiate for me, so that I could do a lot of the optical work. Ray bought this camera from the Bikini Atoll atom test back in the 1950s, and they'd used these white painted rack over Mitchell cameras, standard 35s or whatever they're called. And then at the end of the testing, they painted them black and sold them off. Of course, one of the ones I had was one of those Bikini Atoll radioactive. But he was also quite fair in trying to do deals, because I found problems with the camera and I sent it back to Roy Moore's, up at Elstree, who was looking after the camera side.
Right, yeah.
And they went through it with a fine-tooth comb. They could find nothing wrong. They shot at normal speed. But one of the things they hadn't done is tested the camera at stop frame, which was the way I was using it. And so I asked Charlie Greenlaw, I think his name was, who was the Pinewood cameraman, looked after the cameras, the Pinewood Studios, when they had a camera department. And he came over, he lifted off the magazine, had a look in the slide and said, "Oh yes, I can see what's wrong." And it was something he spotted as soon as I'd shown him the film and how it breathed in the top left-hand corner.
Right, yes.
And, or was it right? Anyway, it doesn't matter. And he looked in the top of the camera and just took the pressure plate up and went and said, "Give it to me, I'll have it back to you for tomorrow, it'll be fine." And he ground off fraction of a millimeter from the plate, and it was perfect after that.
That's incredible, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just years of his experience. Pays off.
So Brian, where would you go for optical work then? Would you go to a separate lab if you were doing things optically as well, sort of duping or kind of cross dissolves and that sort of thing? Or because some of that, of course, would be down to the edit room as well if they were creating dissolves. So where did you go for opticals?
Most of those things would go through the editing suite, through the labs. But when I was working with Ray, I did a lot of the capping miniatures for the shots. You know, where you're in a part of Valletta, I think it was. No, it wasn't Valletta. It might have been Valletta. And on top, you've got temples up above and things like that. And Romanizing, or Greekizing, sorry, landscape around. And that had to be done exactly the same way that Ray was doing his animations to get the creature in front of. So you have a holdback, which I had to paint. And then you do a long exposure of it had to be a long exposure because it was all mostly dated from Willis O'Brien. So I had a huge box to stabilize, which had to be stabilized to the floor of the studio, which had a 1 horsepower motor in, which then had a shaft that went into the side of the camera, and the same thing at the other end on the projector. And the projector was one of Willis O'Brien's projectors, and it was based on a Clappergate camera. Oh, I can't remember the name of it now. But they converted it, and it had a very, very fine mechanism, Clappergate, so the frame was held absolutely steady. I think it was an Acme gate.
That sounds very nice, yeah.
This had belonged to Willis O'Brien, and he'd done a lot of King Kong on it, so I was delighted to be touching this sort of history. And I would then paint sometimes several minutes and holdbacks, and then shoot them in different sections. But to put different bits in, change the sky, change the models on the capping miniatures, or change things in the foreground. When they're walking towards the sort of beehive place where the witches are, that had to be that was shot on an extremely unsteady. It was extremely unsteady. You had them walking through camera, and I had to put in the beehive thing and the obelisk, and that had a 4-way split because they had to march through without crossing any of the matte lines. Part of the mattes had to be, because it was so unsteady, so you could only use the little bit that had actually been shot, and then you had to use other shots which you had to rock and roll backwards and forwards with.
Right, yeah.
So anyway, you also, as you were shooting, you would need to do wedge tests to get the exposures right on various things. And when it came to actually dissolves and things, those were all done at the labs.
Right.
Yeah.
So would you ever, I mean, because you're talking about backwinding the film then and re-exposing, are you?
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, I remember Derek Meddings talking about that for Moonraker. And of course, multiple rewinds. That's incredibly dangerous because all of the work that's gone before is being rewound back, and you're kind of throwing all your money on the last horse. And it's kind of, if it goes wrong, it's not a little bit wrong, it's an absolute fiasco and a disaster. So, I mean, did how much anxiety did you have around backwinding what you were doing and then watching for the next day? Because you wouldn't know until the next day you find out.
I don't think I had particularly much anxiety about that, because you'd frame mark and then you'd wind back. And also because it was going on stop frame, it was more steady than shooting at 24 frames, or as they do 25 these days. So it was steady, and you weren't likely, once you'd established your various wedge tests and so on, it should be just plain sailing, doing each section. Then, of course, there was the statue in the inside of the temple, and head falls off.
Great Maggie Smith, fantastic sequence. That really works well.
Yeah. Well, I'd set it all up with a model that occupied the upper half, and it had to line up, obviously, everything with the lower half, which had the set built on one of the stages. And you had the statue there, and the head comes alive. Suddenly it's front projection had her talking, and I had to then line up everything and do wind backs and so on. And then there was a bit of a problem, because the ACT, the union, insisted that I wasn't allowed to shoot it because I wasn't a cameraman.
So this is the projection of Maggie Smith's face onto. And you say front projection, but do you really mean that you just projected straight onto the plaster face?
It was a white plaster figure.
Yeah. How we have that, Connor? Do we still have the face? We have the head of the goddess.
Indeed, yes, we have Hera's that bust, that head in the archive. Ray kept that as well. So
he's kept it all.
Maggie Smith is there, and yes, quite a sizable piece as well, fairly heavy.
Yeah, so it was heavy, all right. But the funny thing was that I'd set it all up. I'd lined up all the bits of model, and got I lit it so that it matched top to bottom. The top of the frame and the bottom of the frame. And Maggie Smith, all sort of fitted, and everything was fine. I'd set the exposure on the camera and the lens. I'd done wedge tests, so they all worked, and they was ready to go. But I had to have two people on camera. So they got in. I think one was Jack Cardiff, a couple of very famous cameramen to come in. Lighting cameramen who owed a favor to Charlie Schneer, or just wanted to do something with Ray.
That's incredible. For people listening, that's like asking Elvis Presley to do backing vocals. I mean, that's really, to have Jack Cardiff,
the
turning
other one
over
was equally famous. I can't think who it was.
Douglas Slocum.
It might have been.
I mean, wow.
Might well have been.
Just
sounds right. It's Douglas Slocum and Jack Cardiff, and they came in at 9 o'clock. Wasn't 8 o'clock. And they came up to me and said, what are we doing here? And I said, well, what we're doing here, the statue comes alive and talks, and then the head falls off down amongst the crowd. And they both turned to me, or both turned to each other and said, okay, well, you've got a standard Mitchell here. And I said, yes, that's right. And there's a projector there. I said, yes, I've lined them all up. So there isn't much that needs doing. Distances are right. And so they turned to each other and said, well, do you know how to load a standard Mitchell? They haven't done it for 50 years.
Yeah, I can imagine, because they have people, camera DOPs don't really touch things, do they? Yeah. They're the voice of God effectively on set.
That's right.
How wonderful. They're the Lennon and McCartney, really. I'll adjust my Elvis analogy and say it's Lennon and McCartney doing backing vocals.
Yeah, that was lovely. But there's this discussion going on between the two of them. And saying, okay, well, who's going to pull focus? I said, you don't have to worry about focus. I've done all that. So then they said, well, do you know how to load the camera? I said, yes. So I went off. And I then left it up to them, one of them had to do the exposure and so on. And they looked at each other and said, well, how the hell do you do the exposure on something like this? And I said, well, actually, I've already done it. It's all set. All you have to do is press the button. And then very nicely said, well, would you mind doing it? So I pressed the button and we shot the whole sequence. And at the end of it, they said, looked at each other again and said, well, you know how to fill in a camera sheet? So I said, well, I'll tell you what, chaps, I'll do that for you. Don't tell anyone.
So, of course, the neg report sheet would be something that the loader would do, isn't it? Clapper loader would fill that in, and the sheet would go to the lab. One would stay with the production office, and so on. So,
all the details.
And it'd be about which takes are printed. So, in terms of your takes, Brian, did you print everything, or did you choose selected takes?
No, you had to choose the selected tapes because a lot of them. Well, Ray had this major problem with the exposures and colours, as I said, colour filters. And it was a major problem. And Ted Moore did his best to help Ray. Anyway, the point is that with steadiness, if you were doing a multiple exposure, like the one I said with the Stygian witches, the approach to the beehive house and the obelisk on the cliff, that had been shot on a platform that had been built out over a cliff with an updraft coming up underneath it, and it shook. It shook like that, and it was dreadful, absolutely dreadful. But we didn't see the shots until we got back to somewhere that had projection facilities. That was shot on top of El Torcal and Antequera, a mountain on top of just southern Spain. And one of the problems there was, you couldn't actually see next day what had been shot.
No rushes, no dailies.
No rushes.
So how long would you have to wait for your rushes until you got
remember.
back home? Maybe that's worrying, isn't it?
Yes, it's very difficult. So anyway, when we got back home, I was given these things to work on, and there was a problem, which I explained already, that it was shot with multiple holdback mats on bits of steady as I could find from each section. And all the temples and things, apart from the ones when we were in Paestum, those were all done, as little hanging miniatures. And
on location as hanging miniatures.
No capping miniatures. These were done in the studio.
Okay.
We hadn't got time on location to set these things up.
Would you have preferred that though? Because you wouldn't have lost a generation then if you'd done them as hanging miniatures, the Albert Whitlock way, the matte painting.
But I mean, it takes time to do those on location. And you've got we had a transport problem because we were going from place to place very quickly. 3 weeks here, a week here, 2 days there, and then over to Malta, and then to Italy, and then to Malta. And so it was impossible to do an actual hanging miniature, but I would far prefer to have had hanging miniatures that would have kept it first generation.
And would Ray have requested that? Because I know he was very conscious of losing a generation with miniature rear projections, then filming them again on the foreground tabletop. Would he have preferred, you think, to have gone miniatures on location and matte paintings on location?
I think he probably would. Yes. But obviously not for the work he did, because he was using his own animation process.
Yes.
Quite different and required to get a generation down.
And that was always tricky for Ray.
That's why he required the quality of brushes that he'd asked for.
Yes, I can imagine the look on his face when he saw what he was going to work with as background images.
Well, I know.
Background play. He must have been horrified.
Oh, absolutely horrified. I mean, when we had a look at the sequence where you had the scorpions coming out of the gravel bed, the stony riverbed, I mean, that had been shot day for night with a color filter. And you do that, and immediately you've got a grain structure that comes through on the plate, and you've got desaturation of all color. So you can't tone it down a bit here and there. It's gone. There's so you the only thing you can really do is put another color filter over the top.
And I think people now don't realize there's very little latitude in the labs at the time. In terms of using filters when you've gone to a married print and to try and get an answer print, there isn't much you can do. You can't fix it in the lab. Like people say, fix it in the edit. You back in those days, you couldn't really fix things in the lab, whether it was a scratch in the or a hair in the gate or this issue around color temperature. Because even now, when you watch Clash of the Titans and the sequence around they meet Charon, the ferryman going to Medusa's island. There is a jump in color temperature between takes, and it's very off-putting for a major motion picture from the early 80s. Well, that had a big budget.
That should have all been shot clean. It shouldn't have had a color filter and shot, day and night type situation.
Was there ever any talk of replacing Des Davis?
I don't.
You don't think so? No.
I think Charlie, he'd sign the guy up, but he was very demanding in terms of I want this, I want that.
I think I think they brought him in because he was used to working with these great actors, the great names, Claire Bloom, Sir Laurence Olivier, Lord Olivier, and Maggie Smith and others. So I think that was maybe their preoccupation in a sense. But really, they should have gone with other directors they'd used before, who were a much better fit with Charles and Ray, I think. But the film is still marvelous. I mean, we're talking about it here like it was a terrible failure. It's Ray's most financially successful film, and it's been viewed. Oh, absolutely, it's been viewed by more people than any other Ray Harryhausen film as well. The irony is that I don't know if you got my book Harryhausen: The Lost Movies. A sequel.
Yes, I did. Thank you very much for both of them.
You're welcome. And of course Vanessa's brilliant best-selling book Titan of Cinema. A sequel was planned, Force of the Trojans, and it didn't happen. And the irony was it was Ray and Charles's most successful film by far. So really the money was there. So the studio system changed. Special effects were starting to change as they always did.
Yes.
What's your feeling on Clash of the Titans not getting its natural sequel that it should have done, perhaps in 1984?
Well, it's a shame. It's a shame. I would love to have worked with Ray again. When I finished with Ray, I mean, he obviously invited me to look after the sequences I told you about, the models. Oh, there's another wonderful episode. We had a giant wave crashing through a wall towards camera, and we built a tank on the stage, and Ray had sort of specified what he wanted for the tank, and I specified what I needed for the tip tanks and everything else. And Ray, when I looked at what Ray had set up, I thought, that's never going to last anything. I said to Ray, well, that's really not going to work. As soon as that water comes through, it's going to smash everything in front of it, including your wall you built there. It'll go through the wall that was on the film, but it'll also take out the safety wall at the end where the camera's going to be. And he said, oh, no, fill it up and let's do it. So I said, okay, are you sure? And he said, yes, and I'm going to stand here where the camera's going to be. I said, well, Ray, I'd rather you didn't. He disappeared into the room beyond when I let the wall of water go. And he was swept away with the debris of his wall.
Oh, no, gosh. And this was for the...
So we rebuilt it and made it a bit stronger.
And this was for the destruction of Argos, isn't it? The opening of the film where the Kraken comes out and destroys all of Argos, which is truly magnificent. I mean, and a lot of that's overcranked, isn't it? So to get the water to give it scale.
Oh, yes. No, that shot at sort of like
120 frames a second. And was that the fastest you could get a camera to do slow motion by creating that overcrank?
No, there was the Photosonics, which I think did 400 frames a second.
Wow.
You had to rebuild the camera after each take. It had to be re-oiled and gone through with a fine tooth comb so that it didn't jam up again.
Because doesn't it cut frames as you go through at that rate? Doesn't it kind of destroy sprockets sometimes? It's a bit of a risk going at 400 frames. It's kind of a bit of a machine gun approach.
When you get a jam up in a Photosonics, it was a major thing because it happens in seconds. It just totally jams. The whole interior has to then be disassembled and rebuilt. And also you had to have a special operator who was there to look after it to make sure that didn't happen. And that, of course, costs a lot of money.
But all of those scenes, the destruction of Argos was done in daylight, wasn't it? So you weren't using studio lighting. That makes it look more realistic, doesn't it? To have the natural.
Yeah. Part of that was done by Cliff Cully, up on the back lot while we were away in on location. And then there were a couple of other shots which were shot on the stage. And those were shot with artificial light, obviously.
It matches really well, though, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's very good. Very good.
So where does it work with someone like Ted Moore, who is a big name as well? He's a big director of photography. He worked on Bond films as well.
Yes.
How does it work when you're lighting something that has to match his photography? Does him or his team come and see what you're doing? Do you watch rushes together? How do you make sure you're in the same kind of color palette?
No, he's gone off to obviously shoot something else because he's obviously, with his name, he's very much in demand.
Yes.
And a lovely man to work with.
Was he? Yeah, people say that. Caroline Munro worked with him, I think, on The Spy Who Loved Me, and she said to him, he's a wonderful man. That's really important, isn't it? Because your DOP really is in charge of the army of people on a production. So he's like a general almost, isn't he?
Oh yes. No, he's a lovely man and very good. No, he had no contribution at all once it went into Ray's hands. Obviously, I mean, it would be impossible for him to keep an eye on everything. And then the labs obviously tweaked here and there with color temperature or exposure or whatever, so that they were working as well to achieve a unified image.
And did you watch the rushes for the live action stuff as well to kind of get a sense of how things were looking, how things were going? Were you involved in that kind of larger picture as well?
Yes. Obviously, you had to be aware of everything that was happening every day. I suppose the time we were able to do that would be when we got to Italy and Malta. But in Spain, it wasn't so easy. We didn't, because we were traveling around. In Italy, we were based at Cinecittà, and in Malta, we were obviously at the Malta Film Facilities, both having projection facilities, so we could watch rushes.
Cinecittà is famously the home of Baron Munchausen as well, the Terry Gilliam film. And Terry said to me that when he was there, that they got this great deal to film the entire picture at Cinecittà rather than Pinewood Studios, but then they found out they had to pay for absolutely everything on top, virtually from doors to doorknobs to light bulbs, everything on top. But can I ask you, Brian, about Ray Harryhausen's actual animation work then? Did you ever go into his studio to see the various sequences?
Yes.
So tell me about some of those reminiscences.
Well, I think I've told you about the one with the flies resulting from the maggots.
Absolutely, yes. Were you there for Pegasus or Bubo or the Kraken and any of those? That would be amazing to hear.
I think I've still got a little baby Bubo.
Oh.
Well, the body of it. I think I can't find the head. And the wings. The wings were made out of. I maintained these things for him and made the armatures, the little screw armatures and things. And so we worked closely together on those sort of things. I mean, Janet had sort of modeled the body of Pegasus. And then I supplied him with the bits of armature and something he needed for each of these figures.
We found test footage, Brian, of Pegasus, and it's effectively Ray had shot some noddings of Pegasus looking left and then looking right and sort of nodding its head. And he kind of explained to me in previous years that if the tabletop was knocked or the model was knocked or a light went out, you needed something to cut to for safety, so you weren't throwing out all the animation that went before and after.
Yeah.
Do you remember any sequences that were cut for time, money, or budget reasons around the animation, or even the live action, or even in your model work?
I can't remember any of those things.
Okay.
I mean, it was an awful long time ago. It's something like 40 years now.
And when you saw Ray doing his dynamation process with the model, I mean, some of them here are full. So there's a Bubo the owl there.
Yeah.
And these have been made by Star Ace Toys, a Japanese company that we work with closely, and doing all these wonderful replicas for Ray's creatures. There's I think there's a giant Talos up on the shelves up here in the Cyclops and so on. You know, what was it like? What was the atmosphere like when Ray was doing those animations? Because there's no behind the scenes footage, and there's virtually no photography. There's some publicity photography only. But did Ray keep things kind of quiet and to himself, or was it kind of casual in there? How was it when he was animating?
When he was in animation, you didn't disturb him, because he had to remember each move he made, you know, for each part of the body, and go on to the next one. He had a pointer which he could set, but that isn't quite the same thing as doing it in continuity. So you never ever disturbed him when he was in animation. If you went into the studio there when he was animating, but there's never any sort of tension at all. And if he had a problem, he'd just bring them through, and I'd fix them for him.
And it's quite a magical process. What did you think then when you saw Clash? I mean, I know because you're an industry professional, you knew how these films would look, but were you taken by surprise by the film, or its kind of powerfulness of the creatures and Ray's work?
I think I expected the quality of work. You know, I've been a great fan of Jason and the Argonauts in particular, which I thought absolutely brilliant animation, and all his other stuff. And so, no, I expected what I saw.
So do you have a favourite scene or sequence from Clash of the Titans? It can be one of yours, or it can be Ray's, or even a live action sequence. Is there something that you think that captures the film for me? That's Clash of the Titans.
Well, yes, but it never appeared in the film.
Ooh, even better. Please tell.
Well, when we moved to Palinura, from Palinura up to Paestum, where we had the Greek temples, it was very funny. And they had a cutout of Cerberus,
yeah.
Cerberus.
Yeah. And
they had the Italian stuntmen there. And they had to rehearse with this cardboard cutout, which was all painted. It, looked like Cerberus. And it had handles at the back so that another of the stuntmen could dance around with it and pretend to attack. And they were being in Paestum, which was the most wonderful Greek temple location, wonderful ruins. And all these tourists were standing around watching us film. And they saw these Italian stuntmen come up, all dressed in their Greek outfits, and somebody dancing around with a cardboard cutout. They really wondered. I listened to some of the conversation, and I added to it, I must admit. They were wondering what the hell was going on. What sort of film is this? And I explained to them how it worked. And in fact, it was a low-budget film, and we couldn't afford a real dog. They fell for it. But anyway.
That was filmed, Brian? Was all of that filmed as well? That block through, yeah.
Yeah, it was filmed as a guide for Ray. He would then take out they would then shoot it without the dog.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then he would do the animation. But all those people have been all the stuntmen have been pre-rehearsed to come in and lunge and, attack and back off and die. And I knew what was going on, but the tourists didn't. So it was fun to make up a story for them.
And that's a great sequence, the two-headed dog as well. We have the creatures. That's the other thing. Connor can probably tell us a bit about that. Connor, have you told Brian that we have all of the creatures from Clash of the Titans?
No, but that's the interesting thing. Because it's Ray's final film, we have more or less a complete archive for all of the creatures and the miniatures and things that you've mentioned there. So for Bubo the owl alone, we have 4 of the stop motion models, or I should say 3 stop motion models and the remote control model, which I think you had something to do with as well, Brian, if I'm not mistaken.
We also had a stunt double for the remote control one. Yes. We had to keep that thing working all the way through. But there was a funny sequence. Medusa's head, of course.
Where is Medusa's head? We've been looking for that head for years and years and years. Do you know whatever happened to the head with the eyes that open up in Perseus's hands?
Yes. I don't know what happened to it. I could say it's in my bottom drawer.
Oh, I wish it was.
With the Medusa head, we had to make this thing on the move all the time. We were trying to do all the other effects. And again, Janet had modeled the head. And she'd modeled the snakes, but then we had to do all the animatronics to try and get things to move and do everything. And in those days, radio control was fairly primitive, and not particularly powerful motors. So it was a bit of a struggle. But anyway, we get to Malta, and there's Perseus. He holds up the head to kill the kraken, to turn it to stone. And then, everything's wiggling around and everything. And then he finished with it, and he'd come back to me and given it to me. And I was about to put it in a box. And there was a reporter from the Gozo Times who said, "Oh, wait, can I have a photograph of it?" And he got out his still camera and held it up he said, "Could you hold up the head?" I said, "Yep, sure." Held it up like this, so that you get a nice photo of it. And he said, no, I want the snakes moving. I said, "But you've got a still camera." But that was the Gozo Times.
That's incredible. And that's a really iconic sequence as well, when he holds the head up. At the very end of the film, of course, when he holds it up and the actual head does come alive, it's the stop motion head, and it's the head of Medusa coming alive. It's a bit of Ray Harryhausen magic there.
Yeah,
that works really well. Was that was filmed then with the animatronic head on location? Is that right?
Yes.
And Ray laid that over it. Was that the intention, to lay that over it, or?
Well, I think probably it was. Yes. I mean, he realized the limitations. And helped it.
But the Bubo that was on location, was he partly remote control, but also partly rod puppets as well? Was that correct to say?
Sorry, he was remote control.
Yeah, the Bubo. Yeah, was he both? And was there a bit of rod puppetry that went on there as well with Bubo?
I can't think of any. Obviously, there was a stunt double, which had a bit of rod puppetry in the water. But that's about
right,
it,
yes.
really.
Blimey, well, it's yeah. And he comes out coughing and spluttering. It's like that as he comes out. So it's an incredible sequence.
Yeah.
When you look back at your amazing body of work, Brian, having worked on so many great films, I mean, to let people know who are watching here, I mean, some of my favorites, various Bond films, A Never-Ending Story, Superman the movie, Dune, The Dark Crystal. I mean, any one of those films would be incredible to work on, but to have worked on all of those, including Clash of the Titans, are you surprised at the longevity of films that were less successful when they were released and now are considered to be real proper classics?
Yes, I am. In some ways, I was disappointed when they didn't do too well when they first came out. But no, I think one of the problems with CGI is because it is possible to do it, they do it. Whereas in the old days, it was done by a very small crew of people who worked together as a team and thought together as a team. And the whole production was a bit like that. I mean, you knew everybody and you all helped each other. You all worked together and added in creative input as well, which was very nice. It was a nice way to work.
And of course, these films were quite rare. It's rare for a big special effects film to come along, whereas now you can see these kind of things quite regularly. And even when we think of James Bond, when James Bond was on the television, the whole country would stop and watch because it was a very special moment. It would be a Christmas time or an Easter bank holiday. It'd be a James Bond film. Everyone would be watching. Whereas now you can see all these great films at any time of day on virtually any channel. So there's a bit of specialness, I think, perhaps, Brian, that's lost there as well. Would you say?
Yes, indeed. One of the reasons for that is that they're not believable today. Not as believable. When you have the actual effects, I mean, for example, now you've got shots which are. When I worked on the film Dracula with Frank Langella, I did the model sequence in that, and I was asked to do a shot with a ship as it wrecks on the rocks, and asked to do a shot, and it was storyboarded too, of a locked-off camera in the reds over the top of the set, looking down on the waves and the ship and the rocks coming up. And in fact, I didn't think it was going to work. So I said to
John Badham? Was it John Badham? Yeah, I love that film. It's such a good film.
Listen, John, I didn't think that shot's going to work. And he allowed me free rein. Because it was all the time with all the storyboards, it was all the ship going left to right, left to right, left to right, right to left, right to left, and hitting the rocks. And I wanted to come around like that, and I wanted to cross the camera in front of the ship before it wrecked. And he said, "Oh, that sounds a good idea, liven it up a bit." And so he allowed me to have free rein. But the one shot he insisted on was this locked-off shot of the ship wrecking. And I said, well, it'd be far better if I actually put the camera on the top of the mast. And we watched it wreck from the ship's point of view. And so he said, okay, we'll do it your way, but do mine first. So I did it his way. And then I had the camera strapped to the top of the mast and did the shot. And the ship comes in on one of them, and you've got this ship doing that underneath you, and it made you feel seasick because you weren't moving with it. It was doing this underneath you, and it looked dreadful. It locked off helicopter in a tornado, in a storm. That doesn't work. So we strapped the camera to the top, and we did the same shot, and it was marvelous because you were on that ship, you were crashing with it and moving with the mast. And when he started, he said, "Oh, that's the one." And he was excellent. He was a lovely director to work with, very nice.
And that's a great film. That's with Laurence Olivier as Van Helsing and Donald Pleasance. Yes. Great score by John Williams. I'm a big fan of the Frank Langella Dracula. It was years later, because I've watched it many times. It was years later when I was reading about it. I heard and I read, and then I realised he has no fangs. He refused to wear fangs, Frank Langella, for the part of Dracula. And it's testament to him for his brilliant performance that I always thought, no, that's not right. I'm sure I saw the fangs. No, you don't. It's a brilliant, brilliant film. If people listening to this haven't seen 1979's John Badham's Dracula, track it down. It's been recently restored. And there's two versions of it now. John Badham did a kind of a washed out, almost black and white version, as well as a kind of the proper color version. But definitely worth having a look at. It's been marvelous, Brian, that you've taken the time to share your Ray Harryhausen stories with us here at the Foundation. Really appreciate that.
Carry on.
And I'd keep you here, as I say, I'd keep you my prisoner inside these making of books that I've been doing for the last few years, because I need to circle back for Dune and for Superman the movie and basically pretty much everything you've worked on. So we will say goodbye for now, perhaps, but if you'd allow me to get in contact again to speak about some of your other work, I'd be thrilled.
Delighted. It's lovely talking to you.
It's been a privilege for us to listen to you, and I know it will be for our listeners and watchers on the vodcast and podcast. And I want to thank you again. And for anyone listening, please check out Brian Smithies online. You'll see lots of his work, and of course his IMDb profile there. You'll be amazed at the wonderful films he's worked on. Your favourite films are in that list, I guarantee it.
Absolutely. No, thank you very much, Brian. Can I just ask one question just to edit back in, maybe?
Yes, but
I just wondered if you ran into Ray again in the years after Clash of the Titans. Did you meet him at all following his retirement, or were you able to go round to his home?
No, I went round to his home a couple of times, and I met him also at a film convention where we were both speaking, and it was lovely to see him. It really was. Very nice. Outstanding man. Loved him to bits.
That's marvellous, and it's great that he's
And
working.
I must admit, I learned as much from him as I have from anyone.
Right, Connor, that was absolutely fantastic. Brian Smithies deserves a book or two at least. Can you imagine the making of book you could do with Brian Smithies? That would be absolutely spectacular. And we've hit the ground running here with what would be a fabulous, glorious, indulgent introduction by getting him to tease us with anecdotes from the world of Ray Harryhausen, the Clash of the Titans. But that has to be amongst my favourite interviews we've ever done.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a two-parter just on Clash of the Titans. You get the feeling there could have been a few more episodes pulled out of there as well, because Brian had so many clear memories of working with Ray and all of these adventures he had during the making of Clash. Yes, we need a Brian Smithies book. It could be it could be a series of books with the amount of important films he's worked on. And what a lovely man as well. It was a real pleasure to chat with Brian and arrange these podcast interviews. We could have listened to him speak all day because he had so many interesting memories to share. And I hope that everyone enjoyed listening back to his recollections.
Absolutely. And if you did enjoy listening to Brian Smithies and listening to us ask our questions, then comments below in the YouTube channel, and remember to subscribe if you do on the Ray Harryhausen YouTube channel. Then you can actually win prizes. We have books and things to give away as well. So do always stay active with us and listen in our various podcast places. You can find out more about Ray Harryhausen at rayharryhausen.com, where you can find our social media links and all of our news about upcoming events too. Stay tuned, and we'll see you again next time. Copyright in the Ray Harryhausen podcast is owned by the Ray and Diana Harryhausen Foundation, a registered Scottish charity, number SC001419, in the year 2024. This recording may not be reproduced in whole or in part without written permission from the Foundation. The views expressed within these podcasts do not necessarily reflect those of the Foundation, its trustees, contributors, or employees. For further terms and conditions, please contact us at rayharryhausen.com, where you can find our social media links too.